The struggle for the soul of Angola had taken various dimensions. Portugal had colonized the country for many years. Portugal became addicted to Angola and stayed on for years and was not ready to go. Even when other colonial superpowers granted independence to their colonies and handed over power to the locals, Portugal refused to leave Angola. The independence of Angola thus did not come on a platter of gold. Some Angolans took to arms, formed guerrilla groups, and engaged in battle to secure independence for Angola, with an added wish for them to take over the leadership of the country as soon as it was practicable to do so. One of such fighters was the man known as Jonas Savimbi. In this edition of Back in History, we present to you the story of his birth, education, struggle for the independence of Angola, his continued fight after independence under the platform of Unita, and his highly controversial death in 2002 when he was killed in a clash with government forces. Welcome to this edition of Back in History. Jonas Savimbi was born in August 1934. He was born in Mohangu Bie province, a small town on the Benguela Railway, and raised in Chileso in the same province. He attended primary school at home in Angola, and later on he started his secondary education still in Angola, but he later received scholarship to study in Portugal. It was in Portugal that he completed his secondary school education. The initial plan was for him to proceed from secondary school into the university and study medicine. This plan did not, however, materialize due to Savimbi's deep involvement in activism. While there in Portugal, Jonas Savimbi saw firsthand that the Portuguese were not in any way superior to the people of Angola, whom Portugal had ruled for many years. He saw the Portuguese at their lowest point in life and at their highest point too. He met rich people and poor people, even those that depended on others to have their daily bread. The Portuguese were humans, so also were Angolans. They were equally susceptible to all the vicissitudes of life. As young as he was, he interrogated his mind on a lot of issues and wondered why his people in Angola were subjected to colonial dominance by a foreign power. He began to read books on anti-colonial rule. He also followed anti-colonial figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Leopold Senghor, Julius Nyerere, and several other notable African nationalist figures. Jonas Savimbi also associated himself with Angolan students in Portugal. Some of these students also had anti-colonial dispositions. It was here that he met Agostinho Neto, who later became the leader of the MPLA, that is, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola. Agostinho Neto later became Angola's first president. Agostinho Neto at that time was a medical student in Portugal. Savimbi continued in the formation and subtle expression of his anti-colonial views, but was soon spotted by the Portuguese Secret Service, the PIDE. When the Secret Service closed in on him, Savimbi escaped from Portugal and ran to Switzerland, where he settled at Lausanne. His escape to Switzerland was assisted by Portuguese and French communists who were sympathetic to his cause. In Switzerland, he was able to obtain another scholarship, this time from American Christian missionaries, to study social sciences. He then went on to the University of Freiburg, Switzerland, for further studies. While there in Switzerland, Savimbi met Holden Roberts, who was a fellow Angolan. Holden Roberts was a rising star in the independence movement and was the founder of UPA, that is, Union of Angolan People. Holden had made several representations to the United Nations in writing for the grant of independence to Angola. Holden and Savimbi became friends, and Holden made efforts to recruit Savimbi into his movement, but Savimbi was yet to decide whether to commit himself to Holden's movement or to wait a bit more and form his own movement. In the course of his stay in Switzerland, Savimbi attended a student summit in Kampala, Uganda, where he delivered a speech. Savimbi was an orator, and his speech caught the attention of many at the conference. There in Uganda, he met with Tom Mboya, who took him to meet with President Jomo Kenyatta, then President of Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta advised him to join Holden Roberts' UPA. Savimbi then wrote to Holden and pledged allegiance to his movement. This is how Savimbi was inducted into the UPA. Tom Mboya was a Kenyan trade unionist, independence activist, and die-hard Pan-Africanist. He served as Minister of Justice of Kenya from 1963 to 1964 under President Jomo Kenyatta. Anything that had to do with the independence struggle by a citizen or group of people of African descent had the support of Tom Mboya. Owing to frequent travels and active participation in student struggles for independence of Angola, Savimbi lost touch with what was going on in his department in Freiburg University. He thus lost his admission in the university. In all this, Savimbi was still interested in earning a university degree, and in December 1961, he enrolled afresh at the Lausanne University, Switzerland, where he studied law and international politics. Savimbi was very committed to the agitation for the grant of independence to Angola and participated actively in several activities aimed at the attainment of this dream. He traveled widely with Holden Roberts and others and mobilized students and intellectuals to join the movement. Savimbi rose through the ranks quickly in UPA and was made the foreign minister of the organization. Savimbi later felt dissatisfied with UPA and its leadership and thus decided to quit. He first sought to join the MPLA, that is, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, which was led by Agostinho Neto, but he was rebuffed. He then joined the National Liberation Front of Angola, the FNLA, in 1964. Later that same year, Savimbi took the decision to form his own movement, which he named Unita, that is, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. He conceived Unita with Antonio da Costa Fernandes. Unita was designed from inception to have an armed wing, and the mission was to take up arms and engage the colonial masters to leave Angola, since it appeared from every indication that dialogue was not bringing the desired result, namely the independence of Angola. Savimbi went to China and solicited for weapons to assist his movement. There in China, he was promised arms and ammunition and also promised training for his group. These promises were met. When done with the preparations and conceptual framework of his movement, Savimbi returned to his home country of Angola and settled therein. That was in 1966. There and then, he officially launched Unita and began his long-drawn career as an anti-Portuguese guerrilla fighter. He recruited several young men and intellectuals into his movement and embarked on a sustained opposition to the continued colonial dominance of Angola by Portugal. He fought for several years and became a wanted fellow to the colonial power. He was wanted alive or dead. Later on, he fell out with leaders of the other two movements, the FNLA and the MPLA. The fight for the independence of Angola continued for several years, with Savimbi at the forefront. He was dogged, he was unrelenting, and he was a die-in-the-wood nationalist and freedom fighter. For Savimbi, the independence of Angola was non-negotiable. The fight later resulted in a civil war which raged on for years. The other two movements, namely the MPLA and the FNLA, engaged in bloody fights with Savimbi's movement, with each of the groups seeking to outdo the other to gain supremacy and possibly champion the independence cause. Each of these groups at some point had control of the mineral resources of the country in one way or the other, which they smuggled for sale to generate revenue for the purchase of more weapons and payment of salaries and allowances to their fighters. In the course of these fights, several lives were lost. Interestingly, all three warring factions had foreign sponsors. Some were sponsored by the United States of America, while others were sponsored by Cuba, Soviet Union, and many other countries. In the fight, Angolans bore the brunt. They had the highest casualties in the war. It was not just a fight to dislodge the colonial masters, it was also a fight for supremacy among the three guerrilla groups that had emerged in Angola and had divided the country into three for themselves, with each doing everything possible to outsmart the other. The Organization of African Unity later intervened and called for a ceasefire among the warring factions. There was the need for a ceasefire on all sides to allow for meaningful discussion and formalization of the independence of Angola. The Organization of African Unity played a significant role at this point. It made several engagements with Portugal and advocated the need for Angola to be granted independence. The Organization of African Unity also brokered a meeting between the leaders of the three dominant militant groups in the country, namely the FNLA, the MPLA, and Unita. As noted earlier, their leaders were Holden Roberts, Jonas Savimbi, and Agostinho Neto. A meeting was held with them in Mombasa to discuss the ceasefire in January 1974. At that meeting, the factions agreed to form a coalition government and work together for peace and development if the country is granted independence. Eventually, and precisely in 1975, Angola was granted independence from Portugal. A great milestone had thus been achieved to the joy of Angolans and the larger African continent. The supporters of Savimbi expected that Savimbi would become the first president of the country, independence having been attained. Just as they were wishing that their man Savimbi should become the president, the followers and supporters of other groups also thought that their leaders were more suitable to become president. Savimbi had impressed several persons with his oratory skills and organization. He was fluent in no less than 7 languages, including French, Portuguese, English, and others. He had sufficient military training and exposure at home and in countries like China and others. In his speeches before American audiences abroad, Savimbi thrilled such audiences. He was extremely well read. He had the support of America, among other countries, and also had the support of majority of his people. It turned out that Savimbi did not emerge as the first president of Angola. It was rather the leader of the MPLA, Agostinho Neto, who emerged as the first president of independent Angola. Some reports have it that Portuguese soldiers had fought for several years in the war that was waged by the warring factions in Angola, and as at early 1975, the soldiers were very tired of the war. They then left the country unannounced and without officially handing over the reins of power to an indigenous leader. There was thus a lacuna in governance, and the MPLA, which was the only faction with heavily armed men at the capital of the country, seized the opportunity to make their leader, Agostinho Neto, as the new president of the country. This did not go down well with Savimbi and his teeming supporters. Savimbi failed to recognize that government. Savimbi thus continued in his fight through Unita to retain his control of a large area of Angola. His ethnic group was solidly with him throughout his armed struggles. In most of the fights, Savimbi was personally involved and at the forefront. At other times, he gave commands to the foot soldiers. The government of Agostinho Neto did not succumb to his fight. They also fought him fiercely, but on several occasions, Savimbi and his men gained large grounds, and later on, they began to attack government institutions directly and pushed towards a takeover of government. Agostinho died 4 years after, precisely in 1979, and was succeeded by José Eduardo dos Santos. Eduardo had once served as Minister of National Planning in Agostinho's administration. Savimbi continued in his fight long after the death of Agostinho Neto. For him, Angola was still not free, and in line with the name and mission of Unita, Angola needed to be totally liberated, hence his continued fight. In January 1990, and again in February of the same year, Savimbi was wounded in armed conflict with Angolan troops. Still, Savimbi did not relent. He continued to fight. Under much pressure, the government of Angola had to negotiate a ceasefire with his group. Savimbi accepted the ceasefire, and in 1992, he participated in national election and contested for the office of president. There was no winner at the first round, leading to the plan to conduct a runoff. Savimbi sent his deputy and one other person to go to the capital and negotiate the runoff, but on their way, they were attacked, pulled out of their cars, and shot by government forces. Their bodies were seized and never returned to their families. This sparked another round of fights and killing of several persons in retaliation by the Savimbi group. Savimbi withdrew from the election completely and engaged in more fight, advancing seriously towards the capital of Angola. In 1994, a new peace deal was brokered to end the fight. Savimbi was offered the position of vice president, but he declined. Savimbi continued in his fight for supremacy and, in his words, total liberation of Angola. On 22nd February 2002, Savimbi was killed by government forces in a battle with troops along the riverbank in the province of Mozico, his birthplace, at about 3 p.m. Unknown to Savimbi, an ambush had been laid by government troops ahead of his convoy. They drove into the ambush and the troops opened fire. Savimbi's troops responded and a serious fight ensued. In a short while, Savimbi and his men were overpowered. Savimbi was shot several times on the neck, chest, lower abdomen, and other critical parts of his body. He sustained not less than 15 fatal gunshot wounds. Savimbi remained strong and returned fire for fire, but the injuries he sustained soon made him powerless, following which he succumbed and passed on almost immediately. He was 67 years old at the time of his death. It has been reported that not less than 20 of his men were killed with him, including 2 of his long-standing generals. The news of his death filtered in, but a lot of people in Angola did not believe the news. This is because Savimbi was seen by many as an invincible man. Savimbi had survived more than 6 close assassination attempts in the course of his fight. He had also been rumored to have died in battle 17 times, but in all these, Savimbi was very much alive. But this time around, the news of his death was real. Savimbi had indeed been killed. Pictures of his bullet-riddled body were shown on Angolan state television in evidence that he had indeed been killed. Savimbi was quickly buried in the Luena main cemetery in Luena in Mozico province by the government troops that killed him. Appeals were later made by his supporters for government to allow the exhumation of his body for a befitting burial, but the request was refused by Savimbi's age-long rival and enemy, President Eduardo dos Santos. Eduardo stepped down in 2007 and was succeeded by João Lourenço. It was João Lourenço who agreed to the demands of Savimbi's family and supporters and allowed the exhumation of his body in 2019, 17 years after the killing of Savimbi. His coffin was draped in the Unita green and red flag and accompanied by thousands of his former fighters, tribesmen, admirers, supporters, and family members to his final burial ground. Savimbi was survived by several wives and is said to have had no less than 25 children. The death of Jonas Savimbi brought an end to an era in guerrilla warfare and concerted struggle for the independence of Angola and further struggle for a piece of Angola long after the grant of independence to Angola. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I remain your friend and host, Ekemini Udim.